Hey guys, what's up? This is Unrested in Japan, and this FAQ is going to be about my very first week in Japan. This is going to be some of the things that I experienced, and maybe some things you might experience too when you first get here. So first let me tell you a little bit about the trip over. That was on February 14th I left from America, and I left at 5:30 a.m., flew out from Florida. I was living there at the time, and went from Florida all the way to Detroit, and then straight from Detroit to KIX, Kansai International Airport in Japan. And I finally got there the next day at 5:30 p.m. Okay? Now, mind you, we were flying through I don't know how many time zones on the way there, so we lost some hours. But what we had was one of the most excruciating flights I think I've ever been on in my life. It was seated between tons and tons of people on a giant 747. Absolutely cramped. My company had set me up with like the cheapest seats possible on the plane, and I had tried to sleep on the way there, but it just wasn't happening. So by the time I got there, I was brutally exhausted. But I was more excited than I think I've ever been in my entire life when I first landed here. I couldn't believe I was finally in Japan. And not only was I in Japan, I wasn't just visiting, I had just moved my entire life to Japan. And the thought was almost completely overwhelming. But anyway, we were there, I was tired, but I was so excited I had to see stuff the first night I was there. My first area I checked out was Dotonbori and Shinsaibashi. If you've ever checked out those areas in Osaka, you know how many lights, how many people, how much sights there are to see there, and how much, if you're not from a big city like myself, that can be a really great feeling to just see everything there, and just absolutely exciting to take in so much at one time. You also big time look like a tourist when you go there because you're looking around at all the lights and everything at once. You always know the people that live in Japan and the gaijin that are tourists in Japan. The ones who are the tourists are the ones whose heads never come down from all the buildings. All they do is look at all the lights and all the sights non-stop, and they barely look at anything above here. That's how you know. Also, they've got the camera around their neck, but I guess I do too half the time. Anyway, my first night there, I think we stayed out till about 2 a.m. And we didn't go to any bars, we didn't go to any clubs, we just walked around. And my first night there, I already got lost. I was with a bunch of other people who had just come over with the company I'd gotten my first job with, Nova, which I've told you about before. And all 5 of us together were totally lost because we found out Japan has no street names. One of the most disorienting things that we did not expect. I didn't read anything on the internet about this. Now people might say, hey Scott, you know, I've seen some roads of street names there. Yeah, major roads have street names, but every little back alley and turn and small road that only fits 1 or 2 cars, those do not have names, okay? Your major highways have names, every other road does not. So that was confusing. Anyway, the first night there, Nova pretty much shows you your apartment and then just drops you off, and that's it. No orientation towards the area you live in. They gave us a map, but guess what? The map was over 5 years old, and half the places on there didn't even exist anymore, so it was pretty much totally useless. So I guess one of the good things about when I came over with Nova was that we had 1 week before we started work. How it worked was Nova took people in intervals, and so depending on what group you came over with and what time, you started at the next interval, which was the beginning of each month. Now something that really sucked for some people is Nova brought them over maybe on the 2nd or the 3rd of the month. Those guys had to wait almost 1 whole month to start working, and during that time they weren't making any money. So some people were down to the nitty-gritty by the time they finally started work. I came over with about 2,000 American dollars that I had saved up before, and Nova let you take out a loan, which was later discontinued as they started to go bankrupt. So I took out a loan of 1,000. You could do that as well. So that actually gave me quite a safety net so that I knew I wouldn't be dead broke by the time I started work. My first day of work was pretty horrible. Our trainer was pretty much a total asshole. The guy was really a mean guy. And on the first day of training, he told me, you know, you're not doing very good, and it doesn't look like you're going to get through training. You know, and I got really disheartened. I was so excited to go to Japan. I couldn't fail. I could not fail. Later that night when I came home, found out my 2 roommates had the same trainer, and they had both been told the same thing. So I thought, that's a bit strange. They had made it through training, they had done fine, and they were actually, really smart, intelligent guys. One guy had a master's in war history, and the other guy had a PhD in biochemistry and was just taking a break before he went back to work a bigger job. So these weren't idiots, okay? These weren't guys who seemed to fail through any kind of education at all. Later I found out from the next team that had the guy, they had also been all told the same thing. So pretty much this guy had just told everyone they were going to fail to try and push them harder. So that's an example of what kind of training I had to go through when I first got to Nova. I had to deal with quite a bit of assholes. Nova had half Japanese staff and half Gaijin staff. And I don't mean like half Gaijin, half Japanese people. I mean, half of the staff was Japanese and half of them were Gaijin. A lot of the Japanese staff I had to put up with at Nova were extremely abrasive in their personality and extremely unhelpful, as were the Gaijin staff as well. So I'm not saying either one was worse than the other. They were both equally horrible. Some things I needed were help finding a hospital when I first got there because I got such a bad sore throat. I couldn't talk my first week when I was there. I couldn't talk for a day. And when we went there to get some help, no one wanted to help us out. So we actually had to figure out where a hospital was by ourselves with no help. Next, another problem we had was we wanted to start looking for new apartments, and Nova told you before you came there that they would assist you in doing that. But when we went to go get help, they just completely ignored us again. So pretty much I was finding out already that it wasn't all as cracked up to be. I'd already heard some bad stories, but I tried to take everything with a grain of salt and not get too disheartened when I hear about something not working out so well. But pretty much Nova had turned out to be the sinister company that it really was. And later they finally paid the price when all their students and almost all their teachers left them and they went bankrupt. Now my apartment, let me give you a little bit about what my first apartment looked like in Japan. Okay, Nova was notorious for setting people up with as many people as they could possibly fit into an apartment that was totally used by a million Gaijin who had already lived in Japan. Starting all the way back in the early 80s, Nova had been moving people over to Japan. And before they finally crashed, they had continued to cycle through the same apartments with the same Gaijin that they would bring over again and again and again. So I was put in an apartment that I don't know how many millions of people must have lived there before me. Now it wasn't really a million people, but it looked like it had been. Everything in there was torn up. We had, 3 people lived in there, myself and 2 other roommates, and they were good guys. They hadn't trashed the apartment or anything. It was just so old and dilapidated. To give you an example, we don't have any furniture, and so they just give you the furniture that you have when you first move in. 3 chairs, one was broken, you just couldn't sit in it at all. The other one had a back, but if you leaned back in it, the back would break off. And the only one chair actually you could sit in. There was a couch in there, and the couch had already looked like a cat had torn it apart. The stuffing was coming out. They'd tried to tape it up. Pretty ghetto, huh? So then my room, right? The other 2 guys had moved to Japan 1 week before me, and they had taken the 2 biggest rooms. Now, can I blame them? Not really. I mean, what would you do? So when I got there, I found out the room Nova had given me was actually a storage closet, okay? I was living in a room that was maybe about 3 tatami mat big. Now, if any of you know the size of a tatami mat, I'd say maybe it's about 6 feet to 180 centimeters long, okay? Depending on what measurement system you use. So think about that. 3 of those in one room. That's as big as my first room ever was. It was pretty much enough to put down my futon. Now mind you, I only had a futon. We did not have beds. We were given the cheapest futon possible. And it could fit that, and there would be enough room to stand up out of it. And that was about it.